Finding joy in the journey. We've presented thus far some of the themes that are present in the book of Philippians and identified some of those that as Paul writes this book to a cherished group of brethren, that he shares some of these important vital truths. Today, however, what I would like to do is to look at the flow of the book of Corinthians. We will be looking at it in specifics and in smaller sections, but there's an overall flow to Philippians, and I think the deepest current that runs in this book has to do with the subject of joy. Now, when I was thinking about this, it took me back to the days just slightly after the floodwaters subsided, when I was a Boy Scout, and we decided we were going, that was a joke, by the way, we decided we were going to take a canoe trip down the Big Sioux River in the middle of the summer. Well, we spent more time pushing our canoes off of the sandbars than we did canoeing, because the river was pretty dry and there weren't a lot of deep spots and a lot of deep currents in the river. However, we did discover something. The deepest place in a river is not out in the middle. The deepest place in the river is usually right along the edge, the shoreline. And so we eventually figured that out, and we got over to where the water was deep enough that our paddles just hit the sandy bottom once in a while. So there's a current in the book of Philippians. There's a deep channel, if you will, that runs through the book of Philippians. And I believe that has to do with the subject of joy. Now, God inspired every word that Paul wrote, and we understand that from 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16. And there are many messages that are involved in this, but again, there is still this current that allows us to ascertain what Paul says so that we can teach and rebuke and correct ourselves, so that we can be thoroughly complete individuals trying to serve God. The deepest channel in the book of Philippians, I think, has to do with Christian joy. It's much different from happiness, because happiness is tied to conditions. And we have conditions in this world that make us happy, and that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But Christian joy is much different than happiness. The joy Paul discusses here is a deep channel flowing beneath all of the avenues and the events of this life. This particular kind of rejoicing is one that the Bible references very often. As a matter of fact, there are 96 different uses of the verb to rejoice found in the New Testament alone. God attempts to encourage and to infuse us with actions of rejoicing. It is what God expects of His people. It's how He thinks the world should view those who are His children. When you look at a Christian, God thinks you ought to see joy. You ought to see this overarching joy through their journey of life. Now, the noun joy appears 59 times in our New Testament. Joy is the noun which is produced by the verb of rejoicing. God's people are to live with this faith-infused joy, which is a demonstration that they are rejoicing in their attitudes and in their behaviors. Yet the truth is, many Christians find that there's a whole lot in this life that works against us enjoying that kind of deep joy and experiencing that kind of joy. There are many times that our actions demonstrate that maybe it's more of a darkened cloud that we feel like we're living in. Darkened cloud of disappointment. And so when people look at those who are serving God, they really don't see much that's very different from what the common human being is experiencing. And so again, in this book of Philippians, I think God is issuing an overarching challenge to His people that you have a reason to be joyful. You have a reason to rejoice. To this end, I don't think it's without purpose that in these 4 chapters that Paul uses the verb to rejoice 13 times. 4 chapters, 13 times there's a focus on rejoicing. The current of joyfulness controls the flood of truth that is revealed within the book of Philippians. Today what I want to do is I want to get carried away by the strong current of joy that's revealed in the book of Philippians. And I want to begin by looking at 4 things that are identified as the kinds of things that tend to attack Christian joy. What keeps us from rejoicing? I'm going to suggest, first of all, overpowering circumstances. Overpowering circumstances. If we're going to get just 100% honest, it's pretty easy to rejoice when things are going well and when there's a good feeling and there's a benefit, and the negative just gets kind of shoved aside. Because everything is manageable, everything is workable, things are good. You don't find these young people coming back from NYC with frowns on their face. Because why? Because there's a lot of joy that's been experienced there. And it's a very joyful time. But you know what? You hang by those same kids and probably in a month or two, you'll see some frowns. Oh, they're all smiles now. Why? Because life happens. Because the joyful moments are easy to be joyful in. The good moments are easy to experience joy in. It's when we are overpowered by a negative circumstances that joy generally dissipates. And again, any number of things. I put more than circumstances because I think it's the overpowering ones that really remove our joy. You know, we encounter circumstances, but sometimes we quickly adjust and we don't allow them to be joy robbers. But it's when they're overpowering that they tend to take away our joy. Mark Twain made a living as a professional humorist, yet his beloved daughter named Jean died. And at the funeral, he was too ill to attend. And he told a friend this: "I've never greatly envied anyone but the dead. I always envy the dead." What's happened? Circumstance happened in Mark Twain's life that has just overpowered him. And he's envying those who have no life. The person whose joy is dependent upon ideal circumstances is going to be miserable much of the time, because seldom do any of our lives contain ideal circumstances. Byron wrote, "Men are the sport of circumstances." We're the sport of circumstances. Yet in Philippians we find the Apostle Paul in the worst of circumstances for himself, authoring a letter that is saturated with the subject of joy. While in prison, he talks about rejoicing beyond the circumstance that he is in. So the first thing that tends to affect our joy is overpowering circumstances. The second thing I want to suggest is people. People take away joy. I think probably everyone in this room, regardless of your age, experience, or standing, has sacrificed joyful living because of the actions of other people. I think every one of us has allowed something someone has done to rob us of the joy that we're supposed to have in Christ Jesus. Frederick the Great said, "The more I get to know people, the more I love my dog." Most of us understand what he's saying there. We've experienced minuscule and monstrous disappointments in other people. Such disenchantment easily becomes the pretense under which we surrender our joy. We let those people become the excuse for our failure to rejoice always. I think there's something worth noting here, and that is, as often as we feel disappointed by other people and robbed of joy because of the actions of other people, we probably contribute to other people's joy being robbed. This is not a one-way street. You and I tend to disappoint each other. And if we're going to allow our personal disappointments in one another to continue, we're going to find that they will eventually rob us of our joy. So, overpowering circumstances, people. I think another thing that robs us of our joy is things. Things. A man of meager means watched a family of great wealth as they moved into the neighborhood. They had purchased a home, they had remodeled it, and all of these expensive furnishings were being unloaded and brought into the home. And finally, deciding he was going to be the good neighbor, the poor man went over and addressed his neighbor and says, "Neighbor, if you ever need anything, come and see me, and I will tell you how to get along without it." Sometimes we allow things to rob us of our joy. How many of our joys are intrinsically lashed to them? Our materialistic society continually advertises that there's some new thing that's supposed to bring you joy. Something new will buy this and you will experience joy as a human being. Supposedly a true story about Abraham Lincoln walking down the road with two of his sons, and they're fighting and crying and being siblings with each other. He was asked by a gentleman who passed what was wrong with his boys, and Lincoln said the same thing that's wrong with the world. I have 3 walnuts and each of them wants 2. Things. We allow our obsession with things to take away our joy. I wonder, how would your joy be challenged today if you walked home and found that one of your most cherished things was gone, was broken, beyond repair? What would happen to your joy? I know what would happen to mine. Sometimes we allow things to become the source of our joy. And isn't it a terribly ironic thought that the loss of something would remove an eternal joy? And the last thing I want to suggest that keeps God's people from rejoicing as they should is worry. Worry. So many allow worry to deprive them of joyful living. Do you know that a dense fog, and we've had a bunch of that this last week, that a dense fog covering 7 square blocks and 100 feet up. Okay, so that's the area I'm talking about. That dense fog that would affect the safety of travel and even walking, that dense fog comes from less than 1 glass of water. What has happened is those small particles have split up. And you know, that's exactly what worry does. Worry takes a small amount of actuality and evaporates it into a dense fog. And all of a sudden, we can't see, we can't think properly, we can't process, because we're stuck in this mental fog of worry. Worry is faith in the negative. Worry is wasting today's time to clutter up tomorrow's opportunities with today's troubles. Worry is the belief in defeat. Okay, so joy's nemesis includes circumstances, people, things, and worry. Amazingly, Philippians current addresses every one of those joy robbers. Overpowering circumstances drift away in the channel of single-mindedness. You see, circumstances, what they do, how circumstances create the issue is they divide our thinking. Now no longer am I just thinking about service to God, spiritual things. Now I'm also concerned about something else. And my mind becomes divided. And as my mind becomes divided, my joy dissipates. So one of the cures to how circumstances attack our lives is we maintain a single-mindedness. There's an old proverb that says, when the pilot does not know what port he is headed for, no wind is the right one, because he doesn't know where he's headed. James will tell us that a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And again, that's what happens here. Our joy dissipates because we are living with spiritual instability. Single-mindedness enabled Paul to view his imprisonment with joy. Paul is writing this because he has a single mind. He's not thinking about being imprisoned. He's thinking about spiritual things. He's thinking about a group of people who have sent a gentleman with funds to help him and to support him and to illustrate that they're backing him. He's thinking about a special group of people, not about a situation. Single-mindedness enabled Paul to rejoice in those who sought to inflict extra pain in his situation. In the first chapter, he says, there are people who are preaching Jesus out of envy. They're just trying to do me harm. He says, but what? I rejoice. Why? Because Jesus is being preached. I don't care if they hurt me. I don't care if they're against me. Christ is being preached. That's single-mindedness. That situation did not remove Paul's joy. Single-mindedness enabled Paul to see the benefit of both living and dying. And he said, you know what? If I'm allowed to live, it's for your benefit. And if I die, I get to go be with the Lord. Single-mindedness. Could you hurt Paul? Is there any way that Paul could be hurt? No, because if you killed him, he was getting what he wanted. And if he was allowed to live, he was going to do what Christ wanted. Single-mindedness. Paul demonstrates how single-mindedness enabled him to look at all situations with a singleness provided by the care and the will of God. Then he challenges his friends to do the same thing. Just one thing. Just one thing. Live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. That's it. Single-minded. Just one thing is important. You live your life worthy of the good news that Jesus Christ brought into your life. Then whether I come and see you or am absent, that I will hear that you are standing firm in one spirit, in one mind, working side by side for the faith of the gospel. Don't be frightened in any way by your opponent. This is evidence of their destruction, but of your deliverance, and this is from God. For it has been given to you on Christ's behalf, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, having the same struggle that you saw I had, and now hear about me. Paul says it's just this one thing. And this one thing will enable you to suffer, just like this one thing is enabling me to be joyful amid prison. The second thing that Paul suggests, people problems drowned in the current of a submissive mind. People discouragements disappear when the mind focus is upon submission. First of all, submission removes conceit and rivalry. You know, most of our people problems is because we have elevated ourselves. We don't think we should be treated that way. We think we have been wronged. Who's on the top of the totem pole when that's happening? We are. So a submissiveness, an inner submissiveness is going to help us disperse people issues. Submissiveness sees others as more important than self. In this second chapter, Paul begins and he just says, you don't just be concerned about your own interest, but you look out for the interest of others. Submissiveness looks out for the interest of others above those of self. In verse 4, submissiveness imitates the joy-driven life of Jesus, who did not count equality with God something he had to hang on to, but he emptied himself, taking on human form and becoming obedient even to the point of death. Submissiveness. Submissiveness is what helped Jesus with all of his people problems. And submissiveness is what will help us with ours as well. Submissiveness produced self-focused living. What am I doing? How am I doing? Submissiveness is demonstrated in the actual lives of Timothy and Epaphroditus. Paul talks about them at the end of chapter 2, how these faithful servants, by their service, by their submissiveness, have become useful. And everybody knows that. They've overcome all of the people issues. The joyfulness that's constructed around things gets carried off in the channel of a spiritual mind. We have single-mindedness. We have the ability to submit ourselves. But then there's also this challenge for us to develop a mind that rises above things. In chapter 3, Paul focuses on things. He shows the meaningless nature of even some spiritual things. He talks about his spiritual heritage, how he was a Jew, how he was circumcised on the 8th day, how he excelled in all of this. And what does he count those things? As garbage, as loss, so that he might know Christ. Spiritual things can indicate the continual striving to achieve spiritual progress. Enemies of the cross serve their own desires and quest for earthly things. There were people, Paul said, whose God is their appetite, is their belly. And all they're trying to do is to satisfy themselves in what they proclaim and what they teach. Lastly, worries can be swept away in the tide of a secure mind. Worry is really wrong thinking. It's related to the mind and to the thought process. Worry is wrong feeling as it relates to the heart and to the emotional process. And worry usually centers around circumstances, people, or things. The other issues that Paul's already addressed, those are usually the things about which we worry. So if one attempts to nurture and maintain a single mind, a submissive mind, and a spiritual mind, they can foster a secure mind and thus overpower worry. The secure mind enjoys the peace of God which surpasses every thought. That can be mine in Christ Jesus, Paul says in Philippians chapter 4. The secure mind knows that one is enveloped within the power of God. I can do all things, everything, through Christ who strengthens me. You don't learn that unless you have a secure mind. And that kind of secure mind goes a long way in conquering worry. The secure mind understands the provisions of God. As Paul ends out chapter 4, he talks about, I've learned sometimes God gives me a whole bunch, and I've learned sometimes God doesn't give me much at all. But I have learned to be content in whatever situation I'm in. And then he turns around and he praises the Philippians for helping him in his need. And then he says, God will supply all your needs in Christ Jesus. Security. With these kinds of resources, how can we stay stuck in worry? We have the God of peace who is guarding us, according to 4 verse 7. We have the God of peace who guides us, according to verse 9. We have the God of peace who gets our petitions along with our thanksgiving. He receives those from us, according to verses 6 and 7. We have a God of peace who governs our thoughts. We have a God of peace who galvanizes our lives. Does that not sound to you as though we have a reason to live with a secure mind? The channels of joyful living run deep within the instructions, book of Philippians. Such joy becomes reality within the practice of a single mind, a submissive mind, a spiritual mind, and a secure mind. So the book of Philippians addresses all the things that tend to take away our joy. And Paul says, I've dealt with those things.